Hello everyone. Everyone's been calling for a Druid nerf, and Blizzard have delivered that to us. Kind of. Okay, so 5 cards are being nerfed. This is the news, the new patch the news that Blizzard released a couple days ago now. The 5 cards are Innovate, Fiery War Axe, Hex, Murloc War Leader, and Spreading Plague. So let's go through my thoughts on some of these changes card by card. So one of the major cards that's getting nerfed is Innovate. We spoke about this a lot on one of the previous episodes of Magma Rages when we talked about Reynads calling for them to nerf Innovate and some possible solutions as well. In the end, Blizzard have opted to change Innovate to gain 1 mana crystal this turn only. So basically making it like a coin. It's essentially like a counterfeit coin for Druid now, which seems a bit odd. It seems a bit odd in terms of actual like class design. Now that you have basically 2 classes with coins, it's kind of weird as class cards. Um, Personally, I'm not a big fan of the change. I think a lot of the problem Innovate had was giving a big mana advantage early, and whilst this isn't as big a mana advantage by quite some way, it does still help them if it's actually going to see play. And that's the big question. I think the only time you really would want to play new Innovate is probably in decks with Gadgets and Auctioneer. It might be playable in Aggro Druid, but I doubt it. I think this nerf actually hits Aggro Druid a lot harder than it hits Jade Druid. I think that in decks like Jade Druid, your slower Druids, they're actually just going to replace this with something like Maya Keeper for now. Maya Keeper just provides extra ramp and is almost just strictly better than Innovate now. The only trick to that being that very often Innovate Maya Keeper was a substitute to playing Wild Growth on turn 2. So I think what this is actually going to mean is Druids are a lot more dependent on hitting Wild Growth on turn 2. And they're still going to be able to ramp. This is not going to really affect cards like Ultimate Infestation too much. They speak a bit about not being able to innovate out Ultimate Infestation earlier, being a part of the reason for this nerf. But ultimately, like you can just ramp to Ultimate Infestation with cards like Nourish and Maya Keeper, Wild Growth. Those are kind of the bigger things. So I think the Innovate change is probably good. I think Innovate is a little bit too strong. I think that the card also limits design space a bit in terms of what they can actually do with Druid, because they have to bear in mind that everything could be played 2 turns earlier at the least. At the at a bare minimum, basically, with a card like Innovate. So I think it's a good change. I'm not a big fan of the design of the new change. They said they considered other options such as refresh 2 mana crystals, which is something I would have much preferred. It would have avoided you having the mana advantage to play, let's say, a 4 cost on turn 2. Refreshing 2 mana crystals means on turn 2 you could play like a 2 drop plus a 2 drop. Basically meaning that you can only replenish empty mana crystals, which I think would have been really cool and would have made the card more innovative to actually use and more like interesting with a little bit of a higher skill cap than this just gain 1 mana crystal. It also would have been good with cards like Gadgets and Auctioneer still, which would have promoted those kind of high skill cap druid plays where at the moment you don't even rely on any gadgets and auctioneers. You can just ramp into ultimate infestation nonsense. So I'm not a big fan of the change. I would have also just liked Innovate to be something else that they discussed, which was just basically paying mana to get extra mana, which also prevents a lot of the problematic scenarios where you can just innovate out something really early, like innovate out Vicious Fledgling on turn 1, for instance. So if you had to maybe pay 2 mana to get 4 mana, that might be a little too strong. So let's say maybe 3 mana to get 5 mana, something like that. That could work out pretty well because it would actually require you to have some kind of mana investment up front. It would also mean that you couldn't go like um, Ultimate Infestation and then draw an Innovate and then play like a Wrath with the Innovate. I think that is where Ultimate Infestation is most hurt by this Innovate change. Is actually when you Ultimate Infestation, very often you're like, cool, if I Ultimate Infestation and top deck a Innovate in the 5 cards that I'm drawing, which is a fairly high likelihood if you haven't played any Innovates yet, then you're going to be able to still innovate out a hero power to get that extra 1 damage somewhere, or innovate out a wrath or something like that, which can actually make a big difference, especially if you've already played Malfurion the Pestilence and you've got that stronger hero power. So I think innovate's going to hurt Ultimate Infestation in that way, but not so much making Ultimate Infestation unplayable, which is not something I think they wanted. I think this change is definitely going to hurt Druid a lot more than maybe people are thinking. I think Innovate from 2 to 1 is a big change, but um, ultimately I'm mostly just disappointed with the way it's been done. I think they could have done a lot more interesting ways of making Innovate work. So yeah, I think it's still going to hurt Druid a lot, but we'll discuss maybe how things are going to be once we get through all the nerfs. Okay, next we have Fiery War Axe nerf. So basically, Fiery War Axe is changing from a 2 mana 3/2 weapon to a 3 mana 3/2 weapon. What this means is that it's mostly going to affect aggressive and tempo decks, in my opinion. I think that this really does hurt something like Tempo Warrior, especially, as right now a Tempo Warrior would want to be using Blood Razor as well. So what this means is you can't really go Fiery War Axe into Blood Razor curve because you can't use the second charge of the weapon in time. It does mean you can Fiery War Axe, use the second charge on turn 4 and then play Blood Razor, and then Blood Razor use the 2 charges over the next 2 turns. But that makes Blood Razor a lot more awkward because usually you want to be using the weapon on the turn you have the Battle Cry and the next turn when you have the Death Rattle, so you can actually get that uh, 3 sort of damage in on a single target. So I think it really hurts that deck. It lines up better with Forge of Souls now, which is maybe a slight advantage to Forge of Souls, in that if you use Forge of Souls on 2, you can actually get the Fiery War Axe for 3. But ultimately, I think this is also going to hurt Pirate Warrior quite a lot. Pirate Warrior really does rely on curving with Fiery War Axe on 2 a lot of the time, and having Fiery War Axe on 3 is going to make things a lot more awkward, especially if you start buffing it up at all. It's gonna make it worse for cards like Dread Corsair as well. As on 3, you can't play Fiery War Axe plus Dread Corsair anymore. You would need the coin in order to do that. Uh, I think that this is also a good change because Fiery War Axe is a classic card and they don't want to be moving it into Hall of Fame, I don't think. It is a card that's very close to Warrior's identity, so it makes sense that they don't want to move it. And this kind of just brings it in line with a lot of the other 3 mana 3/2 weapons we see. Shadow Blade for Rogue, uh, Rallying Blade for Paladin, and there was, of course, King's Defender for Warrior as well. So this is basically just a worse version of that, which seems fair for a basic card, to be honest. Um, I think the change is actually pretty good. I think they really wanted to get this change in at the same time as getting in the other changes. I think this is something they've been wanting to do maybe for a while for Pirate Warrior or something like that, which, although Pirate Warrior isn't anywhere near as dominant as it has been right now, it's still um, a little bit too strong, and especially when it hits its weapon curve, that's when it's really the scariest. So stopping that weapon curve from, having the reliable Fiery War Axe on 2, or curving from Fiery War Axe into on 2 into Bloodsail Cultist on 3 is gonna help weaken Pirate Warrior quite a bit. So yeah, I think it's a reasonable change. I'm happy with the design of the change too. I think increasing the mana cost seems fair. It's obviously a pretty obvious change or easy change to make, but it does seem fair. I think reducing the attack or durability really wouldn't have worked to actually keep the card viable. I think it would have been a lot worse as a 2 mana 2/2 weapon or even a 2 mana 3/1 weapon. That really wouldn't have been great for Warrior. So I think it's still viable in control decks. I don't think Fiery War Axe is going to disappear altogether. It's just not going to be an instant include in every single Warrior deck going forward, which seems fair as there's not really been a time or many decks that have not wanted 2 Fiery War Axes in them. So they want versatility in or variety in deck building, and Warrior was basically a class where you had 28 deck slots because you weren't gonna not include two Fiery War Axes in every deck. So seems fair that they're nerfing Fiery War Axe in a way. Okay, and next we have Hex, a bit of a surprising one. We're not really expecting any kind of change to Hex. Shaman isn't really particularly dominant now. It's not even Hex is not played in a lot of Shaman decks. Maybe only really played in Control or sometimes maybe Elemental Shaman decks, but even then it still doesn't always see play. I think the change is good though to bring it in line. It's really a nerf to mid-range Shaman in a way. Not something we see right now very much, but mid-range Shaman really does need the extra tempo that's gained from the 3 mana Hex as opposed to 4 mana. It's kind of like a worse polymorph now. Whilst you are obviously giving him a 0/1 minion instead of a 1/1 compared to polymorph, it is giving your opponent a minion with taunt, which is a problem sometimes, especially for let's say a mid-range deck and you're trying to push for lethal. It could be an issue. Um, I think it's okay overall though. I'll be interested to see what other hard removal they look at making for Shaman. I mean, in this set in Knights of the Frozen Throne, we've gotten all this freeze-based hard removal, which is really rubbish, to be honest. So maybe they're trying to open up their space a bit for other kind of removal. I don't know if this was strictly necessary, but once again, I think a little bit like Fiery Warax, this is a change they've probably been wanting to make for a while, and a change that they're kind of slipping in now. And I'll be interested to see if we actually see Hex seeing any play anytime soon, but maybe not unless a mid-range to control shaman is actually viable right now, which at 4 mana this really heavily contests Jade Lightning right now for space in the deck, and that's an issue. Jade Lightning is really efficient removal for aggressive and mid-range decks, and so Hex is a lot worse in that scenario most of the time. Obviously, Hex does have the advantage of actually uh, transforming the minions so it can remove death rattles and can deal with much bigger minions. But overall, I think the change is fair, just a little bit surprising at this point. Uh, I don't really know if it was necessary, but it's good to see them taking some proactive steps in a way. Proactive steps in order to avoid something maybe becoming too powerful. It seems a bit weird. I don't really think it was necessary or that it would have been too powerful if they just nerfed the others and changed it. It seems based on their reasoning that they are really wanting to nerf silence cards in a way, and maybe surprising that they haven't touched polymorph either. But this kind of brings it in line with it. And when I say silence cards, I mean Hex is a effective silence in that it deals with a minion no matter how large it is, no matter if it's buffed, and it also removes death rattles, which is a big part of the Knights of the Frozen Throne theme that were pushing in this expansion. Okay, next we have Murloc War Leader. So Murloc War Leader is basically just changing so that it no longer buffs Murloc's health. I think this is quite fair, to be honest. War Leader was a very swingy card when you played it. In the mirrors, if you co like Valfin or Rockpool or Murloc Tidecaller into Rockpool Hunter into War Leader, the swing is just immense, and that's also because very often you can trade off your minions. You can value trade with your minions that are on board because the extra 1 health makes it much harder to contest them. I don't think that Murloc Paladin's gonna really go away with this. It just means your war leaders are a lot less valuable. It also makes Finger a lot worse, as now Finger doesn't get that surprise health buff when, let's say, a war leader comes out that allows Finger to survive sometimes. That's a very common scenario where Finger attacks into a 4 attack minion and then would survive, whereas now it's going to need Fincher will die a lot more often, which affects a lot of the other decks more than it affects Paladin, affecting things like Water Warrior or Water Rogue. more so than it really does Paladin, as that deck doesn't rely on that specific Finja outcome as much. The War Leader change also, yeah, it really does affect Bluegill Warrior as well. So really that Finja package is a lot worse now, now that you're not getting the War Leader buffs for health. I think it is a big change to Murlocs, but I mean, part of it is that they are suggesting they want to maybe introduce more interesting Murlocs in the future without having to worry about them being too overpowered. Rockpool Hunter they mentioned was a possible target for the nerf, but they um, would rather change War Leader uh, to give the extra simplification of the health buff mechanic because that gets quite weird, being that it effectively heals minions. So if a minion was at 2 health and then goes to 3 health and attacks into something with 1, and then goes to 2 again, and then the war leader dies, it'll still be at 2. Even though it kind of took 1 extra damage between when it was last 2 and now, or when before the war leader and now, as well as the weird effect that it has with Pyromancer equality is one thing they mentioned, which is a little bit of a buff to control Paladin, as that's obviously the Pyromancer equality using class. It also is a bit of a buff to a lot of the other decks that want to contest the Murloc Paladin with AoE spells. So your Token Shaman's pretty good, although honestly Token Shaman was fine with it because it had Devolve, so I didn't really worry so much about the Murloc buff a lot of the time, and you're probably still going to Devolve before Maelstrom Portaling a lot of the time. It does help against Consecration and cards like Volcanic Potion as well now, so it kind of makes the mid-range Paladin a lot more susceptible to AoE removal. And we might see the deck uh, rotate a bit more away from such a heavy Murloc package. It might be that we just see it going more mid-range with maybe more of a um, Divine Shield approach. You know, cards like Bolvar could start seeing play. We've also seen stuff like Skellimancer, so that you can curve Skellimancer into um, Spike Ridge Steed or Bone Mare. So we could see more of like those kind of Buffetins. Also, like the Dread Corsair patches stuff is still pretty strong from like the UK Pala days, where your weapon would reduce the Dread Corsair, so that gives you a good tempo swing. In a way, War Leader was a really big tempo swing for that deck. So it's going to be interesting to see the direction mid-range Paladin takes and what actually uh, the best mid-range paladin list is after this nerf. It was kind of hands down just better to play Murlocs than to play anything else, and I think the health buff on War Leader really is a big part of that. This is kind of going to make Murloc decks a lot more aggressive in nature rather than making Murloc decks what they are now, which is generally kind of more value oriented. Adding the Murlocs actually added a lot of value to a lot of decks, especially with cards like Finja. So this makes the decks that focus on getting value out of the Murlocs and the mid-rangeness of the Murlocs a lot weaker. So I think it's a pretty good change. I think it's going to be interesting to see the direction mid-range Paladin takes. A bit weird that we've mid-range Paladin was kind of one of the decent decks against the Druid, and now it's kind of being nerfed. So what's the big winner from this? What we're seeing so far is the Razakis Priest. Uh, but I'll come back to that after we discuss the last card nerf. So the last card is Spreading Plague, which is basically just changing from 5 mana to 6 mana. Extra mana is always a bigger change than people think. Adding an extra mana to Spreading Plague is probably a larger impact than people think. It's probably a smaller impact than it usually is because it's Druid. Even though they're losing Innovate, Innovate Spreading Plague was not really a thing. Very often your Spreading Plague only comes down after turn 5 anyway, because very often you're maybe going to ramp into it as well. And that's not really going away. I think Spreading Plague is still going to be a decent card. I think the biggest change to the mana here is that you now have less potential mana in a turn as Druid. Especially with the Innovate change, you could have had 12 mana in a turn essentially if you used all your mana and then innovated. Whereas now with Spreading Plague, in particular, you're only going to have 4 spare mana plus maybe 1 or 2 innovates. I suppose technically you could have had 14 mana with double innovates previously. So now that's disregarding like Cocoon things as well, because anyway, that's a different story. But yeah, Spreading Plague, I think the change is going to mostly affect your mid-range token druids. It's a deck that wasn't as popular as Jade Druid and Token Druid, but it affects the Spreading Plague, Strong Shell Scavenger sort of synergy, and it will affect the card's viability. I think the Jade Druids might move away from using it, and the mid-range Token Druid I think is going to be relatively dead. So yeah, I was never really a big fan of Spreading Plague. It was a big surprise to me how good it was, to be honest. So um, I have a tough time really rating this change in terms of whether Spreading Plague is still going to be viable. It is definitely going to hurt the deck though, and I find it interesting that they said that Spreading Plague was one of the top performing cards in Jade and Taunt Druid decks. The Taunt Druid basically being that mid-range token druid I'm talking about. Um, but yeah, they did mention that instead of making it 7 mana, they changed it to 6 because of the innovate change. So it probably could have been 7 mana. At 7 mana, it probably wouldn't be good enough. I think that would be a really big change to Spreading Plague. I think that it be wouldn't be played in any decks anymore. I think that it may still be played in some Jade Druids, but I think it's largely going to depend on the meta. And I don't think Spreading Plague is going to be too popular anymore. And yeah, once again, I think that mid-range token or Taunt Druid is kind of dead. So what does this mean overall? So, mentioned it a little bit already. The Razakis Priest is really getting a big buff from this in a way. Uh, Two of the decks that are really good against it in the Murloc Paladin and the Pirate Warrior are kind of getting hit by these nerfs. So, that's going to help give Razakis Priest a lot more time. And also, Jade Druid will still be hit by the Innovate and Spreading Plague changes. It's going to be the Spreading Plague wasn't so relevant in the matchup against Razakis Priest in particular, but the Innovate change basically means that you can't be innovating out Nourish anymore as easily, basically. And I think that's the biggest impact that the Innovate change actually has is the impact of innovating out Nourish, innovating out a Jade Blossom on turn one or innovating out a Maya Keeper. So when you can turn those temporary mana crystals into permanent mana crystals. And that's a lot harder to do now. So I think that those decks will take a bit of a hit. Uh, the question is really what's going to be punishing them for that. There is the consideration that maybe something like Rogue will be good at punishing the decks for now being a little bit slower. But we're gonna have to wait and see. At the moment, we've got some interesting stuff happening with a lot of these mill decks that are kind of targeting Jade Druid, and a card like Skulking Geist could start seeing more play now as Jade Druid really didn't need that ultimate Jade value of shuffling the Jade Idols at the moment. Uh, and I think Ultimate Infestation will still be good. There might still be some druids running like the Medivh and Ultimate Infestation combo, but I don't think the mid-range token druid, which was so reliant on spreading plague in particular, is going to be super viable anymore. Which is actually that was actually a pretty good counter to Jade Druid in a way. Generally, the deck performed relatively well against Jade Druid, so yeah, I think overall the changes are good. It's good to see them making changes and actually making quite a few changes, which is I think this is the biggest set of nerfs we've had in a very long time, and I'm going to be very interested to see how they pan out. I think the design on a lot of the changes is a bit bleh. Mostly the Innovate one, I kind of don't really like how they did it, but I can totally understand why they did it. And I think the changes are relatively good overall. Uh, Whether there'll be enough, I don't know. Druid is still going to be very strong, but hopefully not as dominant. I think Razakis Priest is going to be really the deck to watch out for, though. And we might see Druid going back to maybe more of a Gadgets and Earthen Scales build in order to actually be really good against Razakis Priest if you can gain a ton of armor. But then we could see Razaka's Priest also bringing in something like Skulking Geist to avoid the really big Jades that would make the armor plan a lot harder or a lot stronger. You know, when you're casting Earthen Scales on a 12/12 Jade, that's a big deal. Whereas if you can't actually get your Jades to that big, then the Razaka's Priest might still be able to deal enough damage with cards like Valen. But we're going to have to wait and see. The patch should be probably dropping after the prelims are all the play. Yeah, the prelims are all played. I'm not 100% sure exactly when it's dropping, to be honest. Uh, but it should be. It'll be pretty interesting, and it'll be definitely before the next championship, as they want things changed a lot more then. I think the one other interesting thing from the changes that they mentioned was the Ice Block. I think they pretty much said Ice Block will be moving to Hall of Fame in 2018. That's kind of the way I read this. It says we've seen discussions about moving Ice Block to the Hall of Fame. As previously mentioned, moving cards to the Hall of Fame occurs at the start of the Hearthstone year, which will occur with the first expansion release in 2018. Our general stance regarding Hall of Fame is that we want to avoid moving cards mid-year. So what this says is, yes, we've heard people talk about Ice Block, but we don't move cards off. They at no point did they say no, we don't want to move Ice Block or we're considering moving Ice Block. They just said we only move cards at the beginning of the year or the end of the year, depending on which way you look at it. So that basically says no. We do want to move Ice Block, and yes, it will happen, which is going to be pretty sad for me, as that will definitely put a nail in the coffin of Freeze Mage this time, unlike the Ice Lance move. And that's going to make Mage have to go a lot more tempo oriented overall. But we're going to get extra expansions before then, so we'll have to see what the state of Mage is going to be by the time Ice Block leaves. But I think this will be the final year for Ice Block in Standard. And on that note, that is all we really have for this review of the nerfs. Looking forward to them actually coming out. Please like, follow, subscribe, share the video, do all those kind of things. You can find me on Twitter at div_gaming. Let me know your thoughts. Maybe there's something I missed about the deck, the uh, nerfs, and if you want to share with me any deck lists as well that you think will be really good post nerf, feel free, and I'll try give you some feedback. You can tweet at me for that, or in the comments section on YouTube possibly. So yeah, thanks a lot everyone, and happy druid hunting post nerf.